Let's begin with our motivation. And remember that the essence of the Buddha Dharma is wisdom and compassion. Wisdom so that we can cut through the ignorance that is at the root of our misery, and compassion so that we can reach out to others who are in a similar situation and be of benefit to them. And so with the motivation to increase our wisdom and compassion, then let's listen to the teachings this evening. So sometimes when we get into a lot of philosophy, like we're in the middle of this section in Precious Garland, that is some rather intense philosophy, sometimes we forget about the compassion side of the path. Yeah, we get so into the philosophy, simply trying to understand it, and at different levels, that we forget the reason why we're doing it. So it's really important to always remember, that the essence of our practice is compassion, and that the purpose is to be able to liberate ourselves and others. Yeah, and so whatever we're doing, be it intense philosophy or raking the leaves, to have that kind of motivation and awareness of why we're doing something, and to really put it within the framework of being of service to other living beings. Okay. So, shall we delve back into the four elements? Yeah. Okay, so last time we were on verse 86. I just want to reread that and then we'll continue. Okay, so 86 said, if each element existed, each of the four elements, earth, water, fire, wind, if each element existed on its own, why wouldn't fire occur without fuel? Okay, likewise, why wouldn't there be water, wind, and earth without coherence, motility, and hardness? So here's somebody saying each of the four elements exists inherently, and when they come together, they form an inherently existent composite. Okay, but we know that that's impossible because anything that is a composite already depends on parts, and anything that is dependent does not have any kind of independent existence or its own essence from its own side. Yeah. So it's quite interesting, to take things in our daily life experience. It's very good practice. When you have nothing to do, when you're waiting for somebody, just look at something and mentally dissect it into its parts and see how that object that you're looking at is simply a compilation of parts. And there's no object itself that's there in the parts. There's just a collection of parts. Yeah? And that each part itself is a collection of parts. And so on down, you can't reach any kind of smallest anything at all. Yeah. So that's very helpful to give us some idea that, things don't have their own essence that makes them what they are. Yeah. That they exist by being merely designated independence upon the collection of the parts. Okay, so in the context of inherent existence, two or more things cannot rely on each other. They must be totally unrelated. Because remember, inherent existence means things are unrelated. So if each of the elements existed inherently, it would, then fire could exist without firewood. Yeah, because firewood's made of earth, water, and air. And the fire is fire, and if they all have their own separate thing, then they can't be related at all. They would be completely different. Yeah. And in that case, then fire wouldn't depend on fuel. Yeah. Now, can you have fire without having fuel? No, because fire burns something, so it needs something to burn. Yeah. So without something to burn, you can't have the fire. So similar with any of the other things, water is cohesion. Without things to stick together, then how can you talk about having water there? Yeah. Similarly with air, the property for moving. If there's nothing to move, how can you talk about the wind element? Yeah. So it is with if earth is hardness, if there's nothing that gives resistance, to anything else, then how can you talk about earth? Yeah. So all these the four elements, yeah, are whenever there's any kind of object, all four elements have to be there. You can't just have one because it can't act by itself. Okay? So it would be like, the first day of school and there's only teachers there, only teachers come. They actually wouldn't be teachers because there's no students. Okay? Now, we only designate teachers because there's the possibility of having students. But after a while, if no students came to that school, a few adults may keep showing up, but they're not going to be teachers. Yeah? Did you have a flashback today?
Morning.
You did very well, guiding them all. I heard you got them all organized before they even got off the bus.
A lot of suggestions from the Venerable Abbess, so it wasn't like it was just my own idea.
Okay, then verse 87 says, if you claim that only fire is well known to depend on fuel, then according to you, how could the other three be independent? It does not make sense for those three to be incompatible with what is interdependently arisen. Okay? So in these kinds of debates, that are going on in this section with philosophers from other traditions, they usually put forth a premise. Nagarjuna usually refutes it. They revise their premise, and if their new premise, I think it's thesis, if their new thesis is incorrect, then Nagarjuna refutes that one as well. Okay, so in response to the previous refutation, now someone says everybody knows that you can't have fire without fuel, but the other three elements are different. If one is not there, the other three can be, so they exist inherently. So it's saying, okay, fire maybe depends on the other three elements, but the other three are totally inherently existent. They have their own essence. Okay? So Nagarjuna, again, kind of hits this straight on. And he says, if only fire is known to depend on fuel, and the fuel is made up of the other three elements, then how can you say the other three elements are independent? You can't. Okay? So if you can't posit fire without relying on the other three elements, you can't posit those three without relying on fire. And they're all of them are totally interdependent. Okay? So each of the other three elements individually are not inherently existent because they arise dependent on each other. Yeah. And if any of them were inherently existent, they wouldn't depend on causes and conditions. They would not be dependent arisings. They wouldn't depend on the other elements, in which case, you could have all these things without having their counterparts. Yeah. So that would mean you could have students without having teachers. People could be parents without having children. Okay. You could have short without having long. All these things would be totally, if they were inherently existent, they would each have their own entity. You wouldn't need the other things that they're mutually dependent upon. Okay? But we see in our world, everything that happens is, we're dependent on other sentient beings. Yeah? You can't be the receiver of a gift if somebody doesn't give a gift, and you can't be the giver if somebody doesn't receive. Okay? So, sometimes we feel like, oh, I'm this independent person. I exist here, and I'm whatever job we have, Yeah, I'm whatever. Okay, we'll pick on you today. Thanks. It's not picking on you. I'm the office manager, okay? So if I develop this identity, I'm the office manager. Yeah. But there's nobody else who has any other positions. And there's no office. Then, how can I be an office manager? Okay? Or forest manager. Yeah. If there's nobody who has any other jobs, then how can you have a forest manager? If there's no Abbey, then how do you have a forest manager? If there's no forest, how do you have a forage manager? There's no trees in the forest. Yeah. Can you have a forest without having trees in the forest? Yeah. So all these things, are posited in relationship to each other. They don't have independent existence. So this is quite important, because sometimes when we have a certain role or a certain job, we get quite attached to it, and we feel this is me, this is my job, my role. But actually the role is something that exists simply because there's other roles that exist. Yeah, I mean, there's people who are the people who write letters to inmates. You can't have inmate letter writers without having inmates. Yeah, so developing some identity of, I'm this person. Actually, we're only any kind of person in relationship to somebody else. Yeah?
Unless you're Donald Trump.
Unless you're Donald Trump. Okay. Okay, but he couldn't pontificate if there weren't an audience. Yeah?
If nobody would listen to him.
Yeah, but I mean, like Aryadev pointed out, remember in chapter 4, that a leader or anybody in any position of authority only has that authority because there's people who come, and people who listen and people who give that person power. Otherwise, that person has nothing, completely nothing. Okay, so. Okay, so where are we? So the 4 elements in any collection, they can't be separated out where you can say, okay, here's earth, so water, fire, air, so that they're totally independent of each other. You can't separate them out like that, okay? But you also can't say that they're totally the same thing either. If they were totally the same thing, then we wouldn't have 4 different names for them, and they wouldn't have 4 different properties. But if they were totally separate from each other, inherently separate from each other, then they would have no relationship, and so they couldn't perform their own individual functions either. Okay? So here what we're seeing is they're not inherently one, and they're not inherently separate either. Yeah? So what are they? Dependent. Yeah. So it's really something, spend some time thinking about this, because we kind of like to go, well, if they're not one, then they're completely separate from each other, So that's our extremist view, isn't it? Yeah. In fact, they're not inherently one, they're not inherently separate. Yeah, they're mutually dependent upon each other. Okay, 88. If those elements each exist on their own, or on its own, we should say. No, each exists on its own. Each exists on its own, not their own. Okay? How could they exist mutually? And if they do not exist on their own, how could they exist mutually? Okay? So this is what I was just saying. If they existed on their own inherently, they couldn't exist mutually. Okay? But if they didn't exist on their own conventionally, then they also couldn't exist mutually. Okay? So things that depend on each other have to be different things in order to be mutually reliant. But being different things does not make them inherently different. Okay? Okay, so here somebody says, although the elements rely on each other, the entity of each one exists inherently. Okay, so here, yeah, they're dependent, but they still have their own essence, inherent essence. And Nagarjuna responds by saying, it follows that they're not reliant on each other because each one exists inherently. Yeah, the reason being that being reliant, mutually reliant, and existing inherently are contradictory. Something can't be both. Okay? Because remember, if something has its own essence, it doesn't rely on anything else. Okay? So the Svatantrikas, and the lower systems, the systems below that, think that things such as cause and effect and all other dependent arisings are both reliant on other factors and inherently existent. So this is who Nagarjuna is relating. Because they're saying, yes, everything's dependent. Because remember, all throughout Buddhism, everybody talks about the 12 links of dependent arising. Everybody believes in dependent arising. All Buddhists do. But some of them can't see that if things are dependent, it means they can't be inherently existent. That's what they miss. Yeah? Because they think that if things are not inherently existent, then they can't be dependent because they would be totally non-existent. Okay? So the prasangikas, use dependent arising and mutual reliance as reasons to prove that things are empty of inherent existence and that they lack existence from their own side. Okay? So inherent existence, existence from its own side, existence by its own characteristics, true existence, all these things from the viewpoint of the prasangika, they come down to the same thing. They mean that something has its own essence in it that doesn't depend on any other factors. Okay? So that would mean, like if you take yourself as an example, that you are you, some independent person, without depending on there being other people, such as your parents. Okay? Now, we don't exist without our parents. Yeah? And whatever roles we have in society, we don't have those roles and exist as those different people without there being other people. You know, you can't have women without there being men, and you can't have men without there being women. Okay, all these things depend on each other. You can't have human beings without having non-human beings. Yeah? Because how would you differentiate anything? Okay? So all these differentiations happen on a conventional level, a relative level, and they're made in relationship to other things. You know, we have the color red because we have other colors. If there were no other colors and everything were red, we wouldn't say red, because there would be no need to differentiate it from everything else. Yeah? So all these things only happen because there's other things. No? It's really, when you think about it, it's really something how interrelated things are. Yeah? That we're human beings in relationship to there being the kitties and other beings besides kitties, not only kitties. Okay? But we're all dependent. You know, there's mutual dependence. Okay. So since the lower systems can't accept that the four elements are not mutually reliant, they must give up their assertion that they inherently exist, which is what Nagarjuna is trying to get across to them. Okay, 89. If each does not exist on its own, but whenever there is one, the remaining three are present, okay, then if not mixed, they cannot be present in one locus, and if mixed, they cannot exist on their own. Okay, so here's somebody saying, is when one element is present in a place, the remaining three elements come with it. So they're agreeing, yeah, with what Nagarjuna is saying. But they're saying all of them exist from their own side, because when there is one element, the defining characteristics of each element come together with it. Okay? So they're saying, it's coming back to saying that they're inherently existent because they have their own defining elements. Okay, so Nagarjuna says, if the remaining three elements are also present whenever there's one element, are their natures mixed or unmixed? So if you have all four elements and you have hardness, cohesion, heating, and movement all together, are all those natures mixed or are they unmixed? Well, if you say that they're unmixed, okay, then according to this person, they've got to be inherently separate. And then, because they're unmixed, they can't be there together in one location, because each one's going to occupy its own place. If they're mixed and inherently existent, then you have mush. You can't differentiate them at all. Okay, so if they're not mixed, they can't be present in one locus because they can't abide together unmixed on one object in one place. But if their natures are mixed, then they can't each exist on their own. In this case, the nature of each element can't exist inherently because it's been mixed with the natures of the others.
Basically, they couldn't mix.
Yeah.
That's what he's saying.
Yeah, he's saying because if they mixed, they would become inherently one and inseparable, in which case you couldn't say there's the four elements there. If they were inherently separate, then they couldn't interact together to form that object. Okay? So it's not correct to think that although the four elements do not inherently exist individually on their own, they exist inherently within being mutually reliant. So this is the thing, what the lower schools want. They want it to be mutually reliant and inherently existent at the same time. They want things to be dependent and inherently existent at the same time, because they don't realize that inherent existence and independent existence are the same, and that independent existence and dependent existence are contradictory and nothing can be both. Okay? So 90. How can elements that do not exist on their own have inherent characteristics? Okay? When mixed, one element cannot predominate since it does not exist on its own. Hence, their characteristics are stated conventionally. Okay? So we define or identify the four elements depending on their individual specific characteristics. Okay? So all the Abhidharma literature, and we've studied all the different classifications of phenomena, they all have defining characteristics. Yeah, everything has defining characteristics. So in terms of the four elements, earth is hard and solid, fire is hot and burning, water is wet and moistening, wind is light and moving. Okay? So these characteristics do not exist inherently because the elements don't exist individually on their own. So remember, you can't have motility without having something to move. You can't have burning without something that burns. Okay? So like that. So someone says, if the characteristics of the four elements are mixed, we couldn't distinguish one from the other. And since they inherently exist, we should be able to distinguish them. Okay. Yeah. So when elements join to form a collection and their natures are mixed, their specific characteristics still exist inherently because there are differences in the extent to which they dominate the mixture. Yeah, so it's saying even though they're mixed and their natures are mixed, in one mixture you could have more hardness, in another mixture you could have more heat, in another mixture you could have more moisture. So they each still have their own specific characteristics that exist inherently, because even when their natures are mixed, their specific characteristics can dominate. One specific characteristic of one of the elements can dominate. Okay? So we can distinguish each element according to its proportion or preponderance in the mixture, even though they've all become the same nature. Yeah, kind of crazy. Okay, so Nagarjuna says, we aren't contradicting Abhidharma. We agree that each element has its own specific defining characteristics. However, when the four elements exist together, although there is a difference in the degree of preponderance of each one's specific characteristics, none of them exist inherently. Okay? The characteristics of hard, hot, wet, and moving depend on each other. Okay. So this person's problem, what's happened to this person is they're confusing having specific characteristics with existing by its own characteristics. Okay? So having specific characteristics simply means on a conventional level, something has its own defining characteristics so that you can differentiate it from something else. Okay? Existing by its own characteristics is synonymous with inherent existence. So this person is mixing up these two. Okay? So they're thinking that because something has, that because a ball has the specific characteristic of being able to bounce, okay, that therefore the ball must exist inherently. Okay? Now, yes, the ball has a specific characteristic of being able to bounce. But it's only able to bounce because there's something hard that it can press against. Okay? So its being able to bounce is not an independent characteristic. The ball does not exist by its own nature independent of anything else. Because you can only differentiate a ball. If you define a ball as something that bounces, then you can only differentiate a ball when there's something that's bouncing. And to have something bounce, it needs to bounce against something else. Okay? So that means that it's not inherently existent because it depends on the floor to have its defining characteristic of being able to bounce. Okay? Because see, if it were inherently existent, it would be able to bounce without there being a floor. Okay? And the ball would be able to bounce without having to inflate it. Okay? So, some problems here. So I wonder, when they have a ball in the space shuttle, if you say that the ball, if you still define the ball as something that bounces, because it's not going to bounce in the space shuttle. So do you define the ball differently there?
Maybe you define it as being round.
Yeah. So then what's the difference between a ball and a tomato? Yeah.
One you can eat and one you can't.
Yeah, so it has to be round and inedible.
So that
Okay.
Then you've got the sun, that's round and inedible.
Edible, right. So then you have to add another characteristic too. Yeah. It's round and inedible and
Plastic. Rubber. Plastic or rubber.
Rubber, plastic. You can have metal balls.
You can call the sun a ball of fire, though.
That's true. You can call the sun a ball of fire. Yeah. So is the sun a ball? Yeah. A ball has a definite limits, doesn't it? Does a sun has definite limits? No, because it's just flaming gas, isn't it? So you can't really, where's the edge of the sun? You can't really outline it.
The photosphere, the chromosphere.
Yeah, it changes all the time.
Yeah,
Yeah, it changes all the time.
it changes, doesn't it? Okay. So it's quite interesting when you really look at these things. It's like, well, what's really the definition of something? You know? And what makes that thing, can we define it so specifically that when we give the definition, we know it's exactly that and nothing else? Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? Yeah. Because there's metal balls, there's balls of gas, you know, or balls of fire. The sun's a ball of fire. Can you have a ball of water? You can have a ball filled with water. Yeah. A water balloon. What about a water balloon?
What about a bubble?
Or a bubble.
Bubble,
Yeah. Is a bubble a ball?
it's round.
Yeah. It's round. It's filled with something. Would you call it a ball?
It's made of water, but there's air inside.
Yeah. So, you know, it's an interesting thing. Under some conditions, you might include a bubble under the category, the broad category of ball. And in other conditions, you might not include it under that category. So then you really can see how things are merely designated. Yeah? If in some situations you include it in one category, in some situations you include it in another.
And it depends a lot on which minds are imputing what on it. So
Exactly.
This diversity of whose minds are looking at it.
Right. I mean, if you look at the situation in the Middle East now, you look at any particular place, and you're going to have a dispute over what country it's in. Yeah? Is this Iraq? Is it ISIS? Is it Syria? Is it, you know? And if you took some of the dirt from one place and moved it somewhere else, then what? And when you say, is it in the control of the rebels or is it in the control of the Syrian government? On any specific day, you're going to have a debate about that. Because each side's going to say, we can control it. But what defines the rebel forces? Yeah, what makes one, you know, somebody a rebel force? I always wondered about this, you know, during the Iraq War. The militants did this and that. I was always wondering, who are the militants? What makes one a militant? Yeah, they never actually tell you who the militants are or who the rebels are.
The people attacking our guys.
No, because we're supporting the rebels. Yeah, I mean, we used to support bin Laden. Yeah, so then is bin Laden a rebel? Or is it, you know? Well, no, he was a terrorist. But when we supported him, was he a terrorist? He was an ally. Can you be an ally and a terrorist at the same time? Yeah. What the people who threw all the tea off the ship in Boston, yeah, were they rebels? Were they terrorists? Or were they patriots? What were they?
Depends on who you're at.
Yeah. Can you be all three at the same time?
Yes.
Just like that glass of nectar.
Yeah. I mean, are they a patriot and a rebel at the same time? Yeah. You're British, aren't you? So yeah. So what were those guys? You know, that threw the tea off the ship. You know? What were they? I don't know. Yeah. Yeah. It's quite interesting, isn't it? Yeah.
Each side believed that they were inherently existently that.
Right.
And that's where we get into trouble.
Right.
And it's the same with the Tea Party now.
Yeah. But actually, you know, the people, all the American Revolutionary people, couldn't you call them militants? From the viewpoint of the British, weren't they militants?
Even they took up arms, were they?
Yeah, they had militias. So doesn't that make you a rebel militant?
They were snipers.
Yeah, and snipers and, you know, all sorts
What
of
does that
things.
make the Tories who fought for the British,
Yeah.
who were Americans?
Oh, traitors.
Or loyalists.
Or loyalists.
Or loyalists. Yeah. They were loyalists to some and traitors to the other. It's so interesting, you know, when you really look at these things, isn't it? Yeah. And then you see, you know, how completely ambiguous history is. Yeah. And yeah. How completely subjective history is. Yeah, you would think that history would be factual, completely subjective. Yeah.
History is written by the victors.
Or sometimes by the unvictors, and then because they have a different history, that gives them reason to,
Hate people.
yeah, to hate some other people. Mm. Okay, I mean, you look, according to the UN Declaration, Israel is a separate country. According to Hamas, Israel doesn't exist. Yeah, quite interesting, isn't it? So does it exist? If it doesn't exist, then who is Hamas fighting against?
Somebody should tell them that.
Or maybe they say, it exists, but we don't recognize its existence. How can something exist and you not recognize its existence? Yeah. Very interesting. People should spend more time thinking about this and less time fighting. Okay. So, yeah. So let's get back to our verse here. So, when proving that the form aggregate, for example, is not inherently existent, the supplement, who wrote the supplement? Chandrakirti. What's it a supplement to? Nagarjuna's treatise on the middle way. Okay. So, Chandrakirti in the supplement, when he's proving that the form aggregate is not inherently existent, the reason is because material things have parts. Yeah. So he's the one who gave that whole thing about the chariot and the parts of the chariot. But you know what? He wasn't the one who invented that example. Yeah. You find that example in the questions of to King Milinda. The Milinda Pada, which is a polytext. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, there's something in one of the sutras similar to that. Well, she was the one, the Bhikshuni was the one who gave this this very famous quotation that the Tibetans quote all the time about the self. Yeah, exactly. It was in her thing, because she said, just as a chariot has parts, so too does the person have parts. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, that was in the Samyutta Nikaya. Yeah, it's quite interesting. Sometimes the Tibetans, they'll say something, and they'll say, "Oh, this comes from Nagarjuna." Actually, it comes before Nagarjuna, because Nagarjuna studied all those scriptures that were around at that time. Yeah, so he used some of their examples. He gave a lot of them a deeper meaning than they were given at that time. Okay. But the reasoning in the precious Garland is slightly different, because here Nagarjuna emphasizes that the elements rely on each other. So that's the reason he's giving for showing that the form aggregate doesn't inherently exist. Chantakirti says because it has parts. Nagarjuna here says because all these elements depend on each other. Okay, so usually we talk about things impermanent things as being dependent because they depend on causes and conditions. Okay, but here Nagarjuna is really emphasizing that the particles are dependent on each other. Okay, so here reliance is demonstrated by analyzing all these tiny particles and showing that the 8 particles that make up a collection of a larger form rely on each other. Okay, so he does that first by looking at the 4 elements, and then, then saying by implication it applies to the 4 derivatives. So the 4 derivatives are visible form, in other words, color and shape, smell, taste, and tangibles. Yeah, sound is not considered a derivative because I'm not sure why. Because all the other things seem much more solid than sound, don't they? Yeah. Okay. So 91. Here's 91. He's talking 91 and 92, he's talking about the derivatives. So this approach also applies to colors, odors, tastes, and tactile objects. Such also is the case with the eye faculty, consciousness, and visible forms, and with ignorance, karma, and rebirth. Then verse 92, agent, object, and action, number, conjunction, which means possession, cause and effect, and time, long and short, and so on, designation and designated as well. Okay, so the first 2 lines of verse 91, this approach also applies to color, odors, tastes, and tactile objects. There, Nagarjuna is just summarizing that, this same kind of object applies to all these elemental derivatives. Okay? So he's saying use the same reasoning to prove that we use to prove that the 4 elements don't inherently exist. Use that to prove that the 4 elemental derivatives don't exist inherently. Okay? And so there too, what you would do is say, okay, if you have some object, that object is going to have color, smell, taste, and tactile. And can you have any object that has only 1 or 2 or 3 of those, but not all 4?
Can you have taste without color?
No, but can you have a thing that has taste without it having color?
I think both water and lye are considered tasteless, odorless liquid. They have a
Well, they're considered, water's considered tasteless. Actually, you can taste water, can't you?
But it would be only in relation to our taste buds.
water is impurity.
Yeah, it's in relationship, it's in relationship to our taste buds, but it's also in relationship to other tastes. Yeah. I mean, water does has, and we may say something is odorless, but actually I think if you had a really sensitive sense of smell, you could probably smell something from it. Yeah. So you can't have any of these elemental derivatives, just one of them, without having the other ones. So that's why they don't include sound, because probably, you could have something, some material object that's not making a sound at any particular time. Although I wonder if science would say that things are always making sounds, and that if you had an acute enough instrument, you could hear the whizzing of the electrons. I wonder. Yeah. Okay. Then the second half of verse 91, so it says, such is also the case. So those, with the first two lines, it's saying that the derivatives are mutually dependent. Now it's going into a whole bunch of other things that are also mutually dependent. Okay? So the first example they have is the eye faculty, consciousness, and visible forms. Okay? So the eye faculty, which is not the eyeball, it's the subtle material in the back of the eyeball. Yeah, so that, and the visible object that you're seeing, some kind of color and shape, and the eye consciousness, the visual consciousness. Okay? Now, usually we say that the consciousness is dependent on the object and the faculty, because the object and the eye faculty, or the eye sense power, it comes before the visual consciousness. Because your eye has to the light rays from the object have to contact the eye sense power before you get a consciousness. Yeah, so usually they talk about those as causally related. Yeah, the object and the sense power as being the causes of that consciousness. But here, what he's saying is they're not those three. You can't just posit them as causally related, as two being the cause for the consciousness. But all three come to be called whatever they are and have their own specific function conventionally only in relationship to each other. So a visual object does not become, we cannot differentiate something as a visual object unless there is the eye sense power and a consciousness. And you can't differentiate something as the eye sense power unless it sees a visual object and generates a visual consciousness. And you can't differentiate, something doesn't become a visual consciousness without there being an object that it sees and the sense power. So we often feel when because we think of things as being inherently existent, we think, okay, here's the object out there, the white of the thermos. It's out there, independent. It exists independent of everything. Here's my eye sense power that, is inside my eyeball, always there, always has been. And then my visual consciousness, that's form, but it's already a visual consciousness, and it's already set to perceive something. That's how we usually think of it, isn't it? Yeah. It's not like that at all. Because these three do not become visual object, eye sense power, and visual consciousness without the existence of the other two. Yeah. We feel like there's a visual consciousness just sitting there, floating in space, independent, that is ready. It's there somewhere, and it's all ready to get to see this independent color white, which is out here somewhere too, you know. And they both, this one's white from its own side, this one's a consciousness from its own side, and this one's waiting to be seen, this one's waiting to see it, and the I is sitting there too, ready to make the connection. Yeah? But it's not like that. White is not sitting out there independently of there being a consciousness that can see it, and a sense power that enables that consciousness to see it. And you can't have an I sense power if there's nothing to see and there's no visual consciousness that can arise. Okay? So these three are posited, you know, as having their individual roles and their conventional, you know, their conventional characteristics in relationship to each other. Okay? So in the same way, okay, that they're dependent on each other, ignorance, karma, and birth are dependent on each other. Okay, where are we getting ignorance, karma, and birth from? 12 links. Okay, and here birth means, you know, all the resultant links. It doesn't mean just the link of birth. Okay? So ignorance causes karma, karma causes birth. So there's, in one way, there's the causal relationship between them. But then there's also the mutually dependent relationship too. Because you can't say something's ignorance if it doesn't produce the result of rebirth and samsara at the end of it, you know? And if it doesn't give rise to polluted karma. How do we differentiate an ignorant motivation because of its result, the polluted karma that was created? How do we differentiate rebirth in samsara because it was produced by ignorance and polluted karma? Okay, so these three also, they're not just causally related, they're mutually dependent on each other. Okay, so His Holiness always explains when he says this, he says, we usually think that the effect depends on the cause, but we never think that the cause depends on the effect. But the cause does not depend on the effect in a causal relationship because the effect does not produce the cause. But the cause depends on the effect in a mutually reliant relationship because something doesn't become a cause unless it can produce an effect. So you don't have any independent cause without there being the possibility of an effect that's produced. Okay? So it's quite interesting. You know, okay, when there might be a tire somewhere, you know, just sitting in the garage. And that's a car part, isn't it? The tire's a car part. How can you say it's a car part?
Because it can go in a car.
Yeah, because it can become part of a car. Does there have to be a car existing right now that it is a part of in order for it to be a car part? No. Because there's whole stores full of car parts. The shops are called auto parts. Auto parts stores. Are there any autos there? No. But you can call it an auto part store because there's the possibility of making an auto out of these parts. Without that possibility, you couldn't call it auto part store, would you? You would probably call it junk store. Yeah? So it's quite interesting to look and say, how do things get the names that they have? Yeah? You have a barber shop. Okay? How does something come to be called a barber shop? Well, there's a barber there, but just having a barber doesn't make it a barber shop. You need customers.
With hair.
With hair. Yeah. So it only becomes a barber shop in relationship to its customers. Otherwise, if you put up, do they still have those things? And you put up a sign, barber shop. But if nobody knew what a barber shop was, and nobody came there to have their hair cut, would you have a barber shop? Well, I don't know. Yeah, the IRS, the state may say, yes, you have a barber shop because you need to be incorporated as a barber shop to put that sign up.
The barber may think it's a barber shop.
Yeah. So it's a barber shop because it does have the potential to bring in customers. Yeah. But if nobody on the planet had hair, would it be a barber shop?
Unless the function of a barber shop was different than the function we've given it with people with hair. It could be a barber shop for people specifically without hair.
They used to pull teeth.
Yeah. So then what they cut?
They could.
Then you would have to, a barber would have to mean something else. Yeah. Yeah. Maybe it would shave poodles or something. Yeah.
Massage the bald head stuff.
Okay. Okay, so all these things are established in relationship to each other. Then the next verse, agent, object, and action. These three you hear again and again, in Buddhism, agent, object, and action. So the doer, the object that's acted upon, and the action itself. Yeah. So those depend on each other. Sometimes they define them a little bit differently, and like the action, what is it? I can't remember exactly. Because like in giving, you have the giver, the gift, the recipient, and the action of giving. So you have four things. So in that instance, they define agent, action, and object as slightly different.
Object could be the gift or the reception.
Yeah, probably. But I forget, they have some strange way of doing it, where action indicates something else. I can't remember what it is. But anyway, it doesn't matter because, yeah, they all depend on each other, whether there's three or whether there's four. Okay? So, yeah. Then numbers. Yeah, numbers depend on each other too. You can't have one without having two. Yeah. So when they all say everything becomes one, automatically your mind has to think two. Yeah, that's why we say non-duality. It's not two. Not two does not mean one. It simply is a negation. One is asserting something positive, and it implies two. Okay? Conjunction or possession, okay, refers to the meeting of two or more phenomena. Okay? So to have conjunction, you need two things. Doesn't exist independently. It can also refer to an object, such as a person who's born in cyclic existence, possessing the attributes of impermanence or dukkha or selflessness, these kinds of things. So a person possesses attributes. Yeah. Again, you can't have a possessor without the attributes that are possessed. What was the other one? Cause and effect. Again, they're related, aren't they? Yeah, like I was just talking, you can't have the two. Time. Yeah, time depends on having past, present, and future. Yeah, without past, present, and future, how can you say that there's time? You know? Now, I don't know what scientists call time anymore. Yeah, they may have a different definition for time, because time, is influenced by gravity. Yeah, because, but then when they measure time like that, then it's dependent on light, and it's based on the assumption that something can't go faster than the speed of light, because then it would get there before it got there. But maybe, we're using visual things as inherent existence. Maybe something can get there. I mean, sound gets there after the object, doesn't it? Yeah, after the light. But, can something get somewhere? Maybe, why not? I don't know what the scientists are saying.
Light is a spectrum anyway, so some of those rays probably travel faster.
Yeah, there might be, right. Right. Different kinds of light. Okay, short and long, also dependent on each other. Oh, and back to time, how time is like when we say 1 hour, we all know what 1 hour is. But is there a particular moment that makes something 1 hour? Like you can count and you can have 59 minutes. Okay, does the last minute then make an hour? Or does the first minute make an hour? Yeah. What exactly is an hour, and what exactly makes something an hour? Like the bucket that's full. What made it full, the first drop or the last drop? Yeah. Okay, so these things are all dependent. When it talks about designation and designated, or no, first before that, and so on in the verse, refers to various other shapes, such as round and square, and other sets of dependent phenomena. So in the verse, it just gave a few things. It said, where are we? Hold on. Yeah, no, we finished. Okay. Yeah, agent, object, and action, number, conjunction, cause and effect, and time, long and short, and so forth, refers to all the other kinds of dependent things that are dependent. Yeah. Like we're going off daylight savings time soon. So daylight savings time depends on ordinary time. Okay. Then designation and designated as well. Okay. Their designation refers to the phenomena that are designated. Okay, so the object. And designated refers to the definition of that object. Okay, so for example, thing is a designation, and that which performs a function is the designated in relationship to it, because that is the definition of thing. Okay? So, just as the elements are not inherently existent, all these other things all depend on something else. And then the words as well at the end of the verse 92 has the meaning of like that. Okay? So, so initially the non-inherent existence of the person was explained. So just like that, the non-existence of the four elements is the same. And just like that, the emptiness of the four derivatives is the same. And just like that, all these other things and other things we haven't mentioned, they're all dependent. And so none of them exist inherently. So the mind that to which these things appear inherently existent, and the mind that grasps them as inherently existent, is mistaken. Okay? So just because things appear inherently existent to our senses doesn't mean they are. Yeah? So just like you look at a TV screen and it looks like there's a person in the TV screen, it doesn't mean there's a person there. Yeah? There's a difference between the appearance and how something actually exists. Okay. So, questions, comments?
There's one online.
Yeah?
Are there still Buddhas when all sentient beings have been liberated from samsara and attained enlightenment? If the Buddhas achieve their purpose, will they still be Buddhas?
Please let me know when you become a Buddha. Okay? In that kind of situation, the thing doesn't have to exist in the present, but just the fact that it can exist in the future or did exist in the past gives, makes putting that label there. Okay.
And well, that calls into question what we can rely on. I mean, our senses are mistaken.
Yep.
So that's fine if we're talking about the gong. I mean, who cares? It's a gong. It's not inherently existent. But when it's a relationship between people, what can we rely on? So at a certain point, it's sort of like you have to have a little bit of faith that someone's going to keep their word.
Mm-hmm.
But you know how it all gets so...
Yeah, so what's reliable? What is solid and concrete and dependable that won't change?
Yeah.
Nirvana. Okay? Whenever anything that is under the influence of ignorance and polluted karma is not going to be reliable. Okay? That's why in Dharma practice we're encouraged, instead of relying on external people and things, to rely on the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha that are at least predictable. Or you could say sentient beings are predictable. It's predictable that they're going to do stupid things and not make sense. That is predictable. Okay? We keep on thinking sentient beings will not be predictable, and that is our problem. Yeah, we think that they will not, that they will be predictable. Yeah, and that's our problem. Okay, so that's why to try and rely on wisdom rather than rely on something that's under the influence of afflictions and karma. Hmm?
And still keep in mind that everyone has this potential to become fully Buddha. So
Yeah, and that, yeah, of course everybody can still become a Buddha. Why not?
I'm not arguing that, but it's just like, I want something to hang on to.
Yeah, we all do. We all want something to hang on to. And The only thing we can hang on to is the fact that things are changing all the time. And learning to be okay with that. Yeah? Learning to be okay with it. You know? Because part of our problem is that we reject impermanence. Yeah? Unless we want something to change, then change is fine. But usually, you know, I want permanence. I want to get this, and I want it to stay exactly like that. But what can stay exactly the same? And do you really want something that's always going to stay the same? Do you want to be in samsara forever, permanently, without any change? No. So in that regard, change is good, isn't it? Yeah. Gives us the opportunity to get out of samsara. Okay. So it's interesting sometimes to sit with that feeling of we're floating in space. Yeah. To just sit with it. And it's like, yeah, that's the reality, and I don't need to react to it with anxiety. Yeah, I can just enjoy it, because that's what is. And there's no way to make it isn't, so you might as well enjoy what is. Does that make some sense?
The only sense there is.
Yeah. Is, you know, just, okay.
Venerable, under the comments, I was reading Venerable Paulin Gyatso's biography.
Uh-huh.
It's just terrifying how the whole Cultural Revolution was about designation, right?
Was about what?
A lot of it was about designation of terms, right?
Yeah.
You're a class enemy, say you're a class enemy. No, I'm not, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And then he went to jail because he wouldn't say his teacher was a spy.
That he went to jail because
His
They were
teacher
telling,
wasn't a spy.
you know, they were
Oh.
saying your teacher is an Indian spy. Confess, confess.
Okay, and he refused to. Yeah.
So then they put him in jail.
Right.
So that just made me think about, you know, so you have these powerful people trying to impose their designation and how he held to his own truth and his precepts.
Yeah.
Like he's not going to lie. And it's also his refuge in the teacher.
Yeah. And he went through a lot of suffering because of it. Yeah. But you know, even if he said, yes, my teacher is a spy, he still would have gone through suffering, probably more actually. Yeah.
So I guess that made me feel more hopeful. Sometimes I look at current affairs and it's like, is it just about being powerful enough to impose your designation on other people? But that you can have some refuge and autonomy, you know, if you're very clear on your own side.
Right. In your own, that's the thing. People can say whatever they want to you. They can call you whatever they want. But you can still have your own personal integrity. You don't have to take on their labels and their projections. That's actually where we run into trouble, is when we take on labels and projections that were taught to us when we were little. Or we invent labels and projections because we misunderstood what adults said to us. Yeah. But as adults now, we can differentiate. We don't need to take those things on. You know? Yeah, Pelling Gyatso certainly didn't.
At great cost physically, but
Yeah.
in the long term.
But he had his own integrity. And that's worth much more, isn't it? Yeah.
And the compassion he developed from that experience is astounding.
Yeah, it is.
And his next life will be less problematic.
Yep.